oh my gosh, have I had some failures along the way. I was watching a recent video a while back by Jason Quinn, who has a wonderful channel about Zen, and I'll leave a link to that video down below, where he goes through some failures that he's had and uses that, I think, as a good basis for a Dharma talk. And so I thought I would do something somewhat similar. There is actually a passage in the early suttas, or not quite the earliest suttas, but nevertheless, where the Buddha is taken to have said, "Mendicants, it's good for a mendicant to check their own failings from time to time." And I've had many failures along the way. For example, I failed to get into the graduate school that I had wanted to get into. There's a long story there, it goes quite a ways, but basically when I was an undergrad, I was majoring in philosophy and really thoroughly confused. I had no particular direction. I know that I liked philosophy. I know that I also liked Buddhist studies, but it wasn't like I had some kind of idea about where I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. I just wanted to do philosophy. Sort of like that was the best thing. And this lack of focus on my own part, for one thing, I took as few philosophy classes as I could as an undergrad. You might say, Doug, why would you do that if you wanted to go on in graduate school in philosophy? And I can only say, well, I was interested in a lot of things. Did some religion, did some history of science, did some creative writing, a whole bunch of stuff. And what it ended up is that I was completely ignorant. At the end of my undergrad career, I didn't even know what I didn't know. I mean, that was, there was so much that I didn't know and didn't even know that I didn't know it. That, yeah, getting into graduate school was something of a fiasco. I failed to choose the right courses as an undergrad as well, failed to choose some of the right professors who now that I look back on, I think, why didn't I take more courses with them? But at the time, I just didn't know. So that was pretty much a failure. At the same time, I was dating a young woman who we were very involved for a time during undergrad and then graduate school, to the point at which we almost became married. We were engaged. It was the eve of our marriage pretty much, and she decided she wasn't interested. Another big failure. And then when I began to gain some real traction and ability and success in graduate school, the whole idea of going on in academic philosophy began to evaporate for me. I began to lose interest in the whole point of doing philosophy. It seemed to me at the time, as I got on in graduate school, that these philosophical arguments were just the same arguments between the same 5 people, decade after decade. Publications that had to be redone because there were other publications and just talking to each other, the same group of people. And I couldn't make my peace with that, especially since when I would go to conferences and talk to people who were on the other side of the job market, they would say, we have an open position and there are 500 applicants for that position. And your eyes would go wide and they would say, well, it's not so bad. Only 200 of them were qualified. And in that whole idea of that job market, having to deal with that, and an evaporating idea of what I really wanted in philosophy, I got my doctorate, but I considered the thing essentially in many ways a failure. Later on, I wrote a novel, couldn't find a publisher for it. It was a complete failure. I wrote a number of short stories as well, couldn't find publishers for those, quite a failure. Then I spent quite a bit of time writing a book about Buddhism. And even with a beautiful foreword by scholar Bhikkhu Bodhi, couldn't get it published. I had one Buddhist publisher who agreed to publish it and then at the last minute after 6 months backed out. So I had to publish it myself. And in certain ways, I can consider that a failure to get this thing published with a decent publisher. So lots of failure here and many more things besides. I'm just scratching the surface. This is the tip of the iceberg here about failures for me. And a lot of this leads to a kind of a feeling of imposter syndrome. This idea that people are mistaken about thinking that I know what I'm talking about, that I have no clue what I'm talking about. I'm just a beginner at all of this, and I feel like I don't belong. There's, when I look back on these failures, that's the kind of feeling that they produce in me. So then, what's the right way forward? How do we deal with this feeling of failure? This feeling that anything good that happens is just luck and not ability, and it's all going to disappear because failure is just the common result here. Well, the first two stages in the 7 factors of awakening or enlightenment are mindfulness and investigation. And so I think when we come to this kind of problem of feeling like a failure, we begin with mindfulness. Be mindful. What is actually happening here? And start investigating. Why is it happening? What is it coming from? When we have failure, they're because we had goals. We not only set up those goals for ourselves, but we begun to cling to them, to identify with them. We begun to see our own future in terms of satisfying those particular goals. So I'm going to be a philosopher, a professor of philosophy somewhere. I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to be so-and-so's husband. We're going to have this kind of family. We're going to live in this kind of place and have this kind of life. It becomes part of my identity. I begin to plan for it, see the future in terms of these things. And then when they don't come true because of failure, quote unquote, of some kind, the goal isn't met, all of a sudden pain arises. Pain because this future isn't here. This future isn't coming true. This future has to be let go of. Of course, it's a lot of mental work to have to redo all these plans and rethink the future for yourself. But it's also a lot of suffering. And this, in a certain way, mirrors the Buddha's idea of the 2 arrows. He has a wonderful early simile of the 2 arrows that stick us all. Or I should say, one of them sticks us all. That's the arrow of pain. We all have to undergo physical pain, for example. And we all have to undergo change. Change is just the way of the world. We're going to have to change our plans from time to time because change happens. But not all of us have to undergo suffering as well, which is the 2nd arrow. Suffering comes about because of craving. We have this craving for continuity. We have this craving for predictability. And when continuity and predictability don't happen, as they often don't, then suffering arises. Notice that something's being a failure at all, depends upon how it's described, how it's framed. So, for example, would I have been happy as an author? It's not clear at all. Would my book have been liked if I had actually published it, or would I have had to deal with bad reviews? Who knows? Perhaps I would have. Would I have been happy as a university professor? Perhaps I wouldn't have. I don't know for sure. I also know that I got a lot of success out of graduate school. It cleared up a lot of confusions for me that I'd had as an undergrad, and so there were a lot of successes involved in having gone through the process of graduate school even without becoming a professor. And in the case of the relationship that I had, it was one that was bound up in a lot of stress and a lot of suffering. So perhaps it's all the best that dissolved before we became married and before it went too far, or at least went farther. And my Buddhism book that I published with the help of Bhikkhu Bodhi has been a modest success. People like it, people enjoy it, and now I'm in control of it in a way that I wouldn't have been if it had been published with a traditional publisher. So, were these really failures? Or instead, was holding to certain goals not useful, not helpful, just producing more suffering, more dukkha? The goal of having a traditional publisher, the goal of having a certain marriage with somebody, the goal of having a professorship as a teacher of philosophy or whatever it might be. Perhaps these goals themselves were the problem. And this is important when it comes to Buddhism in particular, because we often think of Buddhism in terms of the final goal, in terms of success and failure. And this can lead, among other things, to conceit, to this idea of a comparing mind. In Buddhism, the idea of conceit is that we compare ourselves to others. We think of ourselves as better than them, or as worse than them, or even as the same as others. All of these are examples of conceit in Buddhism. So for example, when it comes to failure, some of us will sit down in a meditation room with other people and will fantasize to ourselves about how everyone else is having a much better time of it than we are. That everyone else is so calm and collected, and it's only our minds that are spinning out, that are unable to be controlled. And so we think that we're failing at meditation. I'll often hear people claim that they can't meditate, quote unquote, because they'll say, I sit down and all of a sudden my mind is a monkey mind, is uncontrollable, as though the rest of us have completely controlled minds. This is an example of where thinking of ourselves in terms of a goal, in terms of success and failure, can actually get in our way and stop our progress. It can get to this idea of the imposter syndrome again, where we think of ourselves as fakes, as imposters, as being successful simply due to luck rather than practice. Or we can become conceited by thinking that we're better than other people. I would say that I see this in particular a lot online, where people, Buddhists, seem to lose sight of the aim of practice, which is the elimination or at least reduction of dukkha. Instead, they involve themselves in arguments and conceited claims that only make dukkha worse for everyone around them and really for themselves at the end of the day. Now, I've listed a certain number of failures that I have undergone, and again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are many more where those came from, but all of them made them who I am right now. Who I am and where I am right now would have been different if I had not failed at those things. So we have to look at failure as being important, an important way of bringing us along the path. And we can even think of the Buddha's own experience, where, at least according to the texts, he spent years trying to find the right path to enlightenment. And we might say, failing at it over and over and over. Failing at one thing and another thing and the third thing, at many things over years. Is this really a failure, or is this simply learning what not to do? A very famous quote by Thomas Edison, one of the discoverers of the light bulb, was to say, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. So in many ways, life is the best and only teacher. Yes, we have books. Yes, we have words from teachers and others around us, but oftentimes those don't really sink in the same way that we learn from experience, from our own direct experience. This is something that the Buddha said over and over and over again. So the upshot of that point is that we should learn to relax around this whole idea of goals, of failure and success. Of course goals are important, of course goals are necessary, of course sometimes we will think that we've failed at something, but we should look at that simply as another learning experience. That's the wise way to see it. And moving forward, again, work mindfully with what is present right here and right now. Work with kindness. Now, I began this talk with a quotation or citation from a sutta where the Buddha suggests that we review our failures from time to time. The Buddha had more to say in that sutta. There's more there related to that same point, and I'll discuss the rest of that in the next video, which I'll leave a link to up here on the screen when it's ready. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help support the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.